What you don't want to create is a situation where your body has to make a decision. Do I digest the food or do I sleep? Because digestion will always win. And that's important because there's a buildup of plaque that can happen in the brain, which is called beta amyloid. And beta amyloid is associated with dementia. When we reach the early hours of the morning, we stop producing melatonin, we start producing cortisol so that we can get ourselves up and ready to start our day. If you wake up somebody in the middle of the night, especially in REM, and they're a normal sleeper, they'll say, "Oh, you woke me up." If you wake up somebody with insomnia who's in REM, there's a more strong likelihood that they'll say, "I was awake anyway." We've never actually studied when does insomnia go from being normal, a normal biological reaction to stress, to becoming pathological, having REM. And if we think about what REM's about, it's about emotion. So those dreams are going to be the ones that are more colourful, more fantastic, more unreal, or even more frightening.
If you're on social media, you have surely noticed how often people share their sleeping habits. I've been curious to speak to a sleep expert for some time now, and finally found the perfect candidate who is both the authority in the field, but also is a great communicator. Dr. Jason Ellis is a professor in psychology at UK's Northumbria University and director of the Northumbria Centre for Sleep Research. His research interests include sleep disorders such as insomnia and applied work on CBTI, which we touched on in this interview. He's also the author of the book The 1 Week Insomnia Cure, which you can check in the description. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe. And now we start. Why do we sleep? What is the biological need in that?
So we've jumped in with a very, very big question. When we look at sleep from the outside, you'd think that not much is going on. People are very quiet, they're not moving very much. But since the 1950s, we've started to understand that there's a vast amount of things that go on during the night, during when somebody's actually asleep. And largely, it's all focused around keeping the physical system healthy, protecting it, buffering against illnesses, keeping our psychological system healthy, trying to prevent us from getting unwell, and of course, helping us with our human performance the next day.
And from a biological perspective, like what kind of processes are happening in the body when we sleep?
It's largely about what stage of sleep. And so we've got 4 main stages of sleep, and quite helpfully, they're called stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and REM, or rapid eye movement sleep. And if we start looking at each of those, they can give us certain indicators of what their benefits are for us. So if we get into bed at night, and you know that feeling you get, that sort of warm, cozy, you're sort of drifting in between sleep and out of sleep, that's what we call stage 1. And it's not quite sleep, but what we do see is our brain activity has really quietened it down. So we're getting ourselves ready. So it's more like a portal between wakefulness and sleep. Some people might then experience a little jump or a jerk, just like they've stepped off the pavement too quickly. And that's what we call a hypnic jerk. And that is at the transition from going from being awake to being asleep. And we think it has an evolutionary purpose in the sense that when we were sleeping in environments which were maybe hazardous or challenging, well, we'd have to have a little settle ourselves in just to make sure that we could stay comfortable throughout the night. Then we enter into what we would call stage 2, rather literally. And stage 2 has some very interesting characteristics if we look at the brain. And one of those characteristics is called a sleep spindle. And what you'll see is a very quick spiking in brain activity. And then you'll see something called a K complex, where you have a big spike up, down, and then stabilizes. For a very long time, we pretty much ignored both of those things, thinking that they were just weird. And then a few years ago, we started to uncover what those 2 particular things are and why stage 2 is actually quite important for us. What we now know is that the sleep spindle and the K complex, they're performing 2 tasks. The first is called a sensory gating mechanism. And that's just a very, very posh way of saying it's trying to keep us asleep. So if you think about it, we have very noisy environments. We've got traffic, we've got partners, we've got pets. we've got neighbors, and some of them might have left the television on, or your neighbors might be having an argument. It's in your interests to work out, is that noise threatening or not? And if it's not threatening, to keep you asleep, because our body actually wants us to sleep. And so we will identify noises, work out whether they are potentially harmful or not, something we need to alert to. If it's not, then the K complex and the spindle will help us carry on going to sleep. And the same thing, it doesn't have to be noise. It can equally be pain, for example. And so we create ways to try to keep us asleep. The other factor is we've already exposed ourselves today to vast amounts of information, lots of thoughts, feelings, smells, touch, tastes. You also have to work out, do I need all of this information? And so we use it as a filing system so that we can start to determine, do I need to know that Jason is wearing a lovely jumper, or do I not? And most likely tonight, when you go to sleep, you're going to forget that I'm wearing a lovely jumper, because it's not the vital information that you need to reorganize your memories. So that's what we're doing in stage 2. Then we'll go into stage 3. And this is where all the hard work happens in terms of our physical health. This is where the immune system and the endocrine system and the lymphatic system really are functioning at optimal levels. Now, what does that mean? In terms of the endocrine system, it's regulating a lot of the hormones that are associated with things like fertility, eating, our thyroid, our ability to repair the system when we've had any damage, for example. So we have all of those elements there. The immune system, this is where we hunt out dead cells, where we go and fight cancer cells, where we go and look for foreign objects or build an army in order to fight an infection. That's also happening largely around this stage 3, which we also call slow wave sleep. More recently, we've actually come to uncover there's another vital function of stage 3, and it's about the lymphatic system. So if you ever think of a brain, and it's got all those squiggles, lines that go through it, and they look like plumbing. And that is exactly what is happening in the system. We actually clean through the plumbing at night. And that's important because there's a buildup of plaque that can happen in the brain, which is called beta amyloid. And beta amyloid is associated with dementia. And so we're actually clearing out those potential hazards throughout the night. So really, we are talking about the system really helping us in terms of our physical health in stage 3. Then we have something called REM, rapid eye movement sleep. And in REM, we're actually doing 2 things. We're consolidating a lot of memories. So remember, we've filed everything. We've determined whether we need it or not. Now it's time to organize it in the brain, see where it fits with our existing memories, attitudes, beliefs. But we also emotionally regulate. So if you think about, let's say you've had a really bad day at work and you need to work through that. And it's REM that helps you work through it. It helps you determine what's the stability. I should overreact or should I underreact? And this is where we start to almost put a cage on it and say, well, amygdala, emotional part of the brain, calm down. Let's look at this rationally, logically, and start some problem solving. And so what you're seeing is throughout the entire night, through these different stages, we're really regulating our physical health, our psychological health, and our performance.
My understanding is that those stages are based of the probably activity of the brain, right? That's how they will determine there are different stages. But how did we know that during, let's say, stage 2 or stage 3 or whatever, there is some filing of information is going on? Like, how do we determine that?
Unpleasant things to people at night. So in essence, the way that we've determined a lot of the functionality around our sleep is we've deprived people of certain sections of sleep. So, for example, in some laboratory studies, when you want to deprive people of slow wave sleep, as soon as you see in real time that they're going into this deep slow wave stage 3, you wake them up.
Hmm.
And so you're just allowing them to get other aspects of sleep, but not the one that you're trying to control for. There are also a couple of diseases and disorders whereby people sleep less in terms of a particular stage of sleep. And then we start to see the association between that and different illnesses or diseases. And so it starts to give us the indication that specific dimensions of sleep really are related to different aspects of human health and well-being.
Do these stages constantly exchange, replace each other, or first hour is stage one, etc., etc.? How does it work?
So over a typical night, we'll get into bed, we'll go into N1, we then enter into N2, stage 2, we'll go into stage 3, then we go back up into stage 2. And the reason we believe that we would do that is going from a deep sleep to a light sleep again is just to check the environment is safe for us to continue sleeping. If you think when we slept in caves, it wouldn't make sense for us to be in a deep form of sleep throughout the entire night. We'd need to check whether there were lions or tigers or bears that had come into the cave. So we would circle up back up into stage 2, and then we start our first REM cycle. And then we revolve really on a 90 to 100 minutes cycles throughout the entire night.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's interesting about that is that whereas stage 2 takes up about half of the whole night, the other two main aspects, our stage 3 and our REM, in the first third of the night, you capitalize on slow wave sleep. So you get all the deep, refreshing sleep in the first third of the night. And then over the last part of the night, you're starting to get lots more REM. So in the first iteration, first sleep cycle you have, you're only going to have a couple of minutes of REM. But by the end of the night, you could be having up to an hour's worth of REM.
If my alarm goes off on any of these stages, after which one I'll feel still sleepy, not rested enough?
What tends to happen is if you're awoken during slow wave sleep, N3, stage 3, because it's the deepest form of sleep, what tends to happen is that the body still tries to finish off that cycle whilst you're actually awake. So a lot of people feel quite groggy for the first 40 minutes, an hour even, and that is the body trying to finish off that sleep cycle. It's all about really the same way as if we try to wake somebody up from sleep. Waking somebody up from stage 1 is actually very easy. You just call their name. Waking somebody up from stage 2, maybe you need to raise your voice a little bit and maybe prod them once. Stage 3, it's actually quite hard to wake somebody up from because it's the deepest form of sleep. So that one, you've actually got to physically wake somebody up in order to get them awake. Whereas REM, actually, you can wake somebody reasonably easily. So it's always, if you're waking up from your alarm and you're in slow wave sleep, that's when you feel really like, oh, I feel so unrested.
I believe in one of your lectures you mentioned that we see dreams in REM and in some other stage, and they're a little different. Can you elaborate on that?
They are. So one way to largely determine whether you're in REM and dreaming in REM or whether it's a different stage of sleep is looking at the content. The dreams that we have in REM, and if we think about what REM's about, it's about emotion. So those dreams are going to be the ones that are more colorful, more fantastic, more unreal, or even more frightening. If we're dreaming in black and white and it's very concrete and it's largely tied to maybe what we've done today or things that are on our minds, then it's more likely to be a non-REM dream. The other thing to think about is that dreams actually change in terms of their affect over the night. We have an affective cycle. And so the dreams that we have in the earlier parts of the night, we think are largely going to be more negative. And as we progress through the night, they'll become more positive. And it makes sense if we think about the emotionality of REM. Again, go back to the analogy of had a bad day. I told my boss that I thought he was an idiot. Okay. So in the first dream, I'm going to reenact that terrible scene where I thought he was an idiot and I told him he was an idiot. The second dream is going to be working out, well, what can I do about that? Well, I could apologize. I could run away and leave. I could reinforce the idea. The third dream you're going to have is trying out all those scenarios. What happens if I apologize? Well, that's never going to happen. What happens if I run away? Well, then I haven't got an income. By the time we get to the next dream, we've worked out what things are going to be most beneficial for us. In other words, we've problem solved, we've coped. And that's why we see this more unrealistic, the sort of fantastical dreams really are tied to REM, because we're allowed to fly away from our boss. We're allowed to turn him into a clown.
That's a very nice description of dreams. Most of my dreams kind of make no sense. Do we have like do we understand the nature of dreams? Like, why do we have this particular imagery in our head?
The easy answer to that is we don't actually know. Whereas we've studied sleep quite extensively now, even though it's only 70 years old as a field, the area of dreams has really lagged behind. And I think that's largely because if we think about where dreams sat at the beginning, with Freud, with Jung, with the sort of idea about symbolism and imagery, we didn't really do a scientific evaluation of dreams up until much more recently. Some beautiful work by Rosalind Cartwright, otherwise known as, she was known as the Queen of Dreams. And she looked at the dreams of people that were going through different kinds of stresses, bereavement, divorce. And she started to see that there were patterns in what somebody dreams about in the relation to that particular event, whether they became depressed as a result of it, or how well they functioned after the divorce or the bereavement. And so, again, it reinforces the idea that we are problem solving during this period of time, but we still don't know an awful lot about the content. We're starting to think that maybe it's about forgetting. If you think about, again, we talked about all of that information that we've picked up already during the day, and then in stage 2, we've said, well, do we need this? Do we not need this? There is a theory that we are forgetting through our dreams as well. And so we're piling all of that information and chucking it out in a dream. As yet, we don't actually know. And that's the beauty of it, is that there's still so much to do in terms of the science of dreaming.
Is there an optimal hours of sleep at night? Because I'm seeing more and more that people are competing with each other how little they sleep. Oh, I slept 5 hours, I slept 6. Like, what's norm?
Well, we have a cultural problem around that. If you think about terms like you snooze, you lose, I'll sleep when I'm dead.
Yeah.
My usual response is, well, if you don't sleep, you're more likely to die early. So let's go with that one. Generally, we don't have an optimal number. And we're all different, just like our shoe size, just like our height. What we tend to talk about in terms of adults is generally somewhere between 7 and 9 hours we would see as typical, but somewhere between 6 and 10 we would say is potentially okay. Outside of that is where we start to maybe think about it's abnormal. That being said, there are plenty of examples of people who actually sleep very small amounts or large amounts, and they need that from a biological level. So it's always about finding out what your personal need is. How do you do that? Easiest way to do that, and it sounds wonderfully easy, of course, as you say, you're going to have to take a week off. No pets, no partners, no alarms. Record when you want to go to sleep, when you wake up naturally. Take 7 days of information. Get rid of the first 4, because that's accounting for any sleep deprivation that you might have. If you average out the last 3 nights, that will give you a broad indication of how much sleep you need at this time in your life and under the circumstances. There are variations. If I decided that I wanted to do a lot more exercise, goodness, I'm sure it's not going to happen, but don't worry. I'll probably need more sleep if I do more exercise. So it can change even as a function of what we do in our lifestyle, what we do in our day, and of course, over the lifespan. As we get older, we need less sleep. So not hugely less. I mean, when we start talking about older adults, people around 65 and onwards, well, they probably need somewhere between 6 and 9. But again, is all very individual.
Let's say 8.
Mhm.
And let's also introduce the concept of napping, which I don't think you're a big fan of, right? From what I heard. That 8 hours, should it be like 7 hours at night sleep and 1 hour of napping, or like, no, don't mix these two things
I
together?
think you probably know my answer to that. I'm not a fond fan of napping. So the way I look at it, there are two types. There are people who want to nap, and there are people who need to nap.
Mhm.
If somebody needs to nap, that generally indicates to me that there's a problem with the quality, the quantity, or the timing of the sleep that they're getting now. So a lot of people who have chronic illnesses, for example, need to nap. In those instances, I'm absolutely fine about that. I do have two rules: keep it short and keep it early. And when I say short, I'm talking about 20 minutes.
Wow.
And early, really, we want to be done by the early afternoon. And there's a reason for that. The analogy I tend to talk about is food. If you think about it, we wake up in the morning, we start to get hungry, and then we'll have breakfast, and then we're not hungry anymore. And then we start to have lunch, we're not hungry anymore. And then we build up our hunger again, and we have dinner, tea, supper, whatever we want to call it, wherever we are in the world. Well, what happens if you have a huge buffet lunch? You're not hungry for your dinner. And so if you have a huge long nap during the day, you're going to be less likely to get off to sleep at night. The other way that I talk about it is not doing it late in the day. And again, using the analogy of food, I think any parent has probably said to their child at some point, if you eat that just before your dinner, you're not going to want your dinner. Same thing with sleep. If you sleep or have a nap within a few hours of wanting to get off to sleep at night, it's not going to happen. That drive, those hormones that build up the drive to sleep, just as we build up our drive to eat, they're diminished. Now, there is one caveat. I've talked about a short nap, 20 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
If that's not possible, I would tend to say 90 minutes, but again, keeping it early. That way, somebody can complete a full sleep cycle without it impacting too much on their sleep that they're going to get at night. So again, I do make certain reparations around people who have chronic illnesses or they're going through periods of trauma where they might actually need a bit more during the day.
So 20 minutes or 90 minutes, say it again, why it's such a big difference. What do we have in 20? We don't go through the full cycle. We all go to an hour and a half, right?
Yeah. So the reason I say 20 minutes is because what we don't want people is to actually latch into a sleep cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Remember we talked about slow wave sleep and how groggy and miserable you tend to feel if you've been woken out of slow wave sleep. That's what we want to try to avoid. And so for the first 20 minutes, you're going to be in lighter forms of sleep. Therefore, you're not going to get into that deep sleep whereby you're going to wake up and feel even worse than when you started. I think we've all had a nap where we've woken up and thought, well, that was great. I feel horrible. It's what we call sleep inertia. Our brain is trying to finish the sleep cycle. Our body is trying to get us up and working.
Interesting. And so power naps is like basically sleep in the first stage. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Why do you feel better though? Like, why do you feel rested after that?
Because we're still calming down the brain. We're still starting to process information, and we are going to get little fragments of deeper quality sleep. One of the challenges we have, and I think it's a disservice that we've done as a community, we've talked about stage 1, stage 2, slow wave sleep and REM. They're actually determined upon how much brain activity over a period of 30 seconds. Mm-hmm. So it's saying, on average, are you in stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, or REM? But actually, you can have little fragments within that 30 seconds of REM or of slow wave sleep. And so we tended to sort of create quite gross ways of measuring sleep at the moment. Whereas when we start to look into the actual minutiae of those individual 30-second epochs, as we call them, we actually can see a lot more richness within that data.
We tend to sleep at night and nap during the day. What's the reason for that? Why do we get tired at night outside the fact that, let's say, we spent all day doing some stuff?
So this is largely a fact of two elements. The first is what we call our drive to sleep. And I talked about it when I was talking about napping. When you wake up in the morning, you shouldn't really have any drive to sleep, but that will increase and increase and increase and increase. And the main thing about the sleep drive is it does not reset itself until you have slept. It doesn't matter how much coffee you drink. It doesn't matter how many Coca-Colas you have. It's not going to reset until you have slept. And so that will build. And one of the things that we see is that GABA is the hormone, really, that builds in pressure, that builds up that pressure to sleep at night. So you think we're awake during the day, we're functioning during the day, and we're building up more and more pressure to sleep. But then we have something called the circadian rhythm, the body clock. And the body clock waxes and wanes over the 24-hour period, and largely does this through the production or inhibition of a hormone called melatonin. Now, we talk a lot about melatonin, and certainly in the US, people talk a lot more about melatonin than in the UK. It's a signaling hormone. It's not making you sleepy per se. It's more likely to be signaling you that it's time for you to go to bed. And so it works on light and dark cues. If it's dark, as it is in the UK at the moment, this is registered by the retina. The signal will travel down the optic nerve, tells a little P inside our brain here, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, it's dark, release the signal. And then that will tell the pineal gland to produce melatonin. And so as the darkness increases, more melatonin is produced. And this also coincides with our body temperature. When we reach the early hours of the morning, we stop producing melatonin, we start producing cortisol so that we can get ourselves up and ready to start our day. So between the drive to sleep and the wave of our body clock, it creates what we would call a sleep window. And that sleep window is when the drive is high, melatonin is high, and that is the optimal time to sleep. For humans, that happens to be at night.
People who work at night and tend to sleep during the day, is their body adjusted for melatonin and kind of gives the opposite, how do I say it, command, or not necessarily?
It does, but it takes a while to do it.
Yeah.
And so when we start talking about doing shift work, we either want people to do shift work for short amounts of time, like 2 to 3 days, when their body does not adapt by the time they've finished, or we talk about them doing it for 3 weeks or longer. That way, we actually start to adapt. The challenge always is that we're still trying to sleep during the daytime. And that creates not only challenges from a physiological point of view, we're not getting the signals coming through the retina, but it also creates what we would say is a social problem as well. A lot of people who do shift work, for example, they'll come home from their shift, they put on the laundry or they'll put on the dishwasher and they'll fall asleep on the sofa. There's going to be daytime noise. There's going to be daytime light. There's going to be the beeps and the bloops from our machines. So one of the constant issues that we have with people who do work at night is that they're slightly sleep deprived because they build up not quite as much sleep as they would if they were sleeping in the nighttime. And it's those long-term issues of working at night that we see are related to a lot of health issues.
You spent considerable amount of time studying insomnia. How do you define insomnia?
It's an interesting question because, you get this a lot. People will use the term insomnia quite frequently. Oh, I didn't sleep terribly well last night. I have insomnia. We actually have diagnostics. And our main diagnostic criterion suggests that this is a self-reported problem of either a difficulty getting off to sleep, staying asleep, or waking up too early in the morning. And this should occur despite giving yourself enough time to sleep or adequate opportunity for sleep. We also then talk about more of the quantitative criteria. It should happen for at least 3 nights per week, be present for at least 3 months, and it should be causing some form of daytime distress or impairment. Now, I certainly have very specific views about 3 months. I don't believe insomnia is insomnia after 3 months. I think it's insomnia is insomnia after about 2 weeks. Where did the 3 months come from? People have decided, well, it's 1 month. Some people have decided, well, it's 6 months. We've never actually studied when does insomnia go from being normal, a normal biological reaction to stress, to becoming pathological. And that's, I think, something that myself and colleagues in University of Pennsylvania have been working on for the last couple of years.
Is it considered to be a disability or illness, or what is this?
I think that's one of the beautiful things that happened in 2013. One of the diagnostic categories that we tend to use, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, for the first time classified it as a disorder. Up until that point, it was largely seen as a symptom. And I think we can see this when we go and see our PCPs, our GPs. Even today, we can go in and say, oh, I have insomnia. And there's a very strong likelihood that our GP or our PCP is going to say, well, is it because you're depressed? Is it because you've got coronary heart disease? Is it because you have diabetes? So up until relatively recently, it was seen more as a symptom rather than a diagnosis in its own right. Now we see it as a diagnosis in its own right. And there are three main reasons why we now see it as a diagnosis. The first is we can see from research that having insomnia can create other illnesses, or at least increase the risk of developing those illnesses. The second reason is if we actually treat insomnia in people who have other illnesses, diseases, and disorders, it impacts not only on the sleep, but actually on the particular illness that somebody has as well. So, for example, when we've given people who have got insomnia and depression, we've treated the insomnia, we see quite good, significant reductions in their depression as well. And the third reason is, when we start to talk about the economic and the social impact of insomnia, it's big. We're talking about £50 billion in the UK in terms of the direct costs, medications, seeing GPs, going to hospital, the indirect costs of absenteeism, presenteeism, accidents. So it's become a point of which we need to intervene. And the best way to do that is to frame it around a disorder, so it's not just treated as a byproduct of something else.
Are there like different types of insomnia, or it's all one?
It's a great question. Again, it's been more theorized than actualized, but largely we start to talk about three main types of insomnia. We can talk about psychophysiological insomnia, and this is an insomnia that's been typified by anxiety, worry about sleep, preoccupation with sleep, conditioned arousal to sleep. And you see this a lot in patients with psychophysiological insomnia. They'll say, you know what, I fell asleep on the sofa watching television, and I thought to myself, oh, I'm ready for bed. And so they quietly make their way to bed because they don't want to disturb the sleep. As soon as they go to the bedroom, it's like all the lights have come on. And that's a conditioned arousal to the bedroom itself. So that's our psychophysiological insomnia. Then we have something called idiopathic insomnia. And this is where somebody's had lifelong insomnia, usually starting just before puberty with very little period of remission. So they're constantly having these struggles around sleep. A lot of people in that framework will talk about, oh, I've always been a light sleeper. It's a very good indicator of somebody who's maybe idiopathic. The third group is our interesting one. Not that the other two aren't. I've been studying the other two for years, but this one's fascinating. These are people who will report raging insomnia, really bad insomnia. But actually, if we looked at their brain activity and their objective sleep, they're sleeping fine. These are what we call paradoxical insomnia patients. So there's a big paradox between what they're reporting and what's actually happening physiologically.
Do you think they're just lying because they're self-reporting and just want to get pills?
No, absolutely not. It's an interesting point, and it's certainly one that I will say, no, they're not mad. There is probably a neurobiological reason for this.
Mm-hmm.
This was a really nice theory that was put forward by Michael Perlis at UPenn. And he said that either people are predisposed, or as a point of acquisition of insomnia, they develop something called cortical arousal.
Mm.
And what we mean by that is during sleep, parts of the brain should be shut down. They should be in their default mode. And one of those parts is the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex covers things like memory, short-term, attention, perception, reasoning. And of course, it makes sense. You don't need those whilst you're asleep. Sleep should be an amnestic process. You shouldn't remember being asleep. And what Michael is saying in his theory in 1997, which he's followed up over time, is that maybe people with insomnia, and these particular individuals with paradoxical insomnia, maybe it's not fully switched off. And if you think of it, if my prefrontal cortex is not switched off, even though I was physically asleep, I'm going to be neurologically awake, and therefore I'm going to remember sleep as being awake. And this is interesting, and a lot of the studies that were done, some beautiful work by Célène Bastien, who's at the University of Laval, she woke people up with insomnia in the night. She was actually asking about their dreams, but what she also noticed is that if you wake up somebody in the middle of the night, especially in REM, and they're a normal sleeper, they'll say, "Oh, you woke me up." If you wake up somebody with insomnia who's in REM, there's a more strong likelihood that they'll say, "I was awake anyway," which is a good indicator that that part of the brain is not as down-regulated as our people with normal sleep.
So it doesn't necessarily mean that there is something wrong with them. It's just unusual.
They're not crazy.
Yes.
There may be just something that's going on a neurological level that means that they can't get that shut off that we actually need.
How do sleeping pills work? What do they activate to put people with insomnia to bed?
Again, it's about looking at the process of sleep. So the way that I love to talk about sleep with patients is, let's talk about sleep as a box. So you've got a box in front of you. During the daytime, what actively suppresses sleep are 6 particular hormones that sit on top of the box. These are called acetylcholine, norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, histamine, and orexin. Okay? They actively suppress sleep. And so one of the earliest drugs that was developed really to try to help with getting off to sleep was an antihistamine. And if you think about it, of course, if you knocked off histamine off the box, more likely that sleep will open. The reason that we chose histamine as the first one was because histamine is the person that will not leave your house after a party. You think you have the dinner party, there's always one person that has one more drink, they've got one more anecdote. That's histamine. Histamine stays in your house, so it makes sense to knock it off. Inside the box is GABA, and this is the building pressure, and eventually there's so much pressure inside the box that the box has to open. The next set of drugs that were developed, the benzodiazepines and the Z-hypnotics, increased the potency of GABA. And so their process was, let's increase the power inside the box so it's going to open up even if histamine wants one more drink and an anecdote. There are challenges with both of those types of drugs in terms of the pathways. Some of them can be addictive, some of them are very difficult to withdraw from, some have side effects when you do withdraw from them. And so most recently, actually in the last year or two, we've been developing drugs which are focused on knocking orexin off the top of the box.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas histamine stays the longest in your house, orexin's the heaviest. And so it would make sense then, if you knock off orexin, then it will allow the box to open. So these are the drugs that we've developed over time to try to manage sleep.
We heard the stories when people had overdose on those medications. Like, what exactly is happening? They knock it off too much of the histamine or whatever?
In essence, when we're talking about an overdose from whatever drug it might be, and certainly that was much more a case of the early drugs. If we think about some of the first early drugs, they were opiates.
Yeah.
And so they would naturally have the sedating qualities, which could then lead to over-sedation. Overdoses largely around some of the other drugs, certainly not orexin, because we haven't really looked at that side of it because it's so new. But some of the others, what we would tend to see is a lot of alcohol also being used. And this is one of the challenges that we do have. Alcohol, of course, is a beautiful sedative. Anyone who's ever tried alcohol will know the more of it you drink, the more silly you become, and then you fall asleep. The problem with alcohol is alcohol tries to escape from the system because it's toxin. So it tries to escape from the system quite quickly. And so the only way to do that is to sweat it out. In order to sweat it out, you've got to raise the body temperature. If you raise the body temperature, you're going to fragment the sleep that you get. And so what you're creating then is a lot of problems around REM. And that's also associated with very poor mood. And so it's one of the reasons we certainly don't want to advocate alcohol to sleep. I'm not saying you can't have a cocktail with dinner tonight, but I certainly wouldn't recommend using alcohol to sleep, and certainly not with another medication.
Interesting. And is insomnia in general, is it genetic or not necessarily?
It's a great question, and we haven't really got down to the genetics of insomnia yet. There is some indications that there is a heritability. In other words, if your parents have it, your biological parents have it, you're more likely to get it. I have a problem with that. And I do tend to have a problem with sort of saying, oh, there's got to be a gene for it. It's a rather challenging way to look at it. I think there's always gene and environment mix, the epigenetics. But even when we talk about the heritability of insomnia, and we did a study many years ago looking at children who don't have sleep problems, but their parents do have insomnia. And we saw that the children were more sensitive to attitudes, beliefs, and terminology around insomnia. The question always remains is, what part of that is genetics, the biological basis of it? But what's the other part? Mummy can't play, she's tired. Daddy doesn't want to take you to football because he's absolutely exhausted. So is it about the learning of dialogue, or is it about the actual genetics of it? We haven't got to an answer about it yet, which is a bit of a shame, but there is some indication there will be a genetic component to it.
What is CBTI?
So we've talked about the drugs that we use for insomnia, which we don't actually recommend as the first line. What we recommend is CBTI, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. This is a form of talking therapy, although unlike other forms of CBT, it's actually quite formulaic. And what we're doing here is we're identifying dysfunctional patterns of behavior, sleep realistic beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors, and we're identifying those back with the patient so that they can manage those. So it's really largely built upon the premise that insomnia is normal. It's normal, it's adaptive. What turns it pathological is our compensatory mechanisms. So if we think about it this way, I'm not sleeping terribly well. How am I going to manage that? Well, you know what? I'm going to go to bed early. Oh, fantastic. I'll go to bed an hour early. I'm going to have a lie-in. I'm going to stay in bed an hour later. I'm going to have a nap during the day, a nice big long nap during the day. I'm going to drink alcohol to put me to sleep. I'll drink coffee to keep me awake. All of these things seem natural and logical to do, but they actually destroy the biological process of sleep. And so what you'll find is then someone spending a lot more time in bed awake. And when we're spending a lot of time awake in bed, what are we doing? We're trying to sleep. I will go to sleep. I will go to sleep. It will happen. No. Or I'm going to while away the hours with my phone or my tablet or my games or do whatever I want to do because I'm not sleeping. Or I'm just going to lie there getting angry, frustrated, and miserable and worrying about, well, tomorrow I'm going to, in my field as a teacher, tomorrow my worry is I'm going to lose it with a student because I'm so tired. And this then creates a vicious cycle between the behavioral elements of going to bed, changing our routines, drinking our coffee, and our worries and concerns about the short-term impact, the long-term impact, the anxiety. CBTI identifies all of those elements and then teaches someone, this is probably not the best way to do it. Let's talk about what your ideal amount of sleep or time in bed should be. Let's talk about what's normal or not. Let's talk about that anxiety and the worry. One of the things that we think about within the framework of CBTI is that worries at night are very different to worries during the day. And again, there is a neurological reason for that. Remember, I talked about the prefrontal cortex is down. It covers problem solving, rational thought, reward inhibition. So those thoughts that we have at night are catastrophic. I'm going to kill a student. As opposed to in the day, I'm just going to be really irritated by one. Again, it's identifying that these things they're not because somebody's crazy, but there are reasons for them that we can help manage. So that's the framework of CBTI. Generally, in the framework, we'll have about 6 sessions, maybe 8 sessions. Each is about an hour long, where we talk about identifying better patterns, habits, and routines, and breaking old habits and routines, and of course, managing those anxieties, worries, and beliefs.
I had a guest who was head of task force for DSM-4 before DSM-5 came out, right? And his concern was that these DSMs that get more and more loose on the definition of illnesses, and as a result, people are getting over-medicated. Do you think people are jumping into medication too early and should focus on CBTI or not necessarily?
It's a difficult subject in the sense that I think CBTI is the first line treatment. We talk about it. Most organizations in the world will say that CBTI is the first line treatment for insomnia. We know it's effective for about 70 to 80% of people that stay the course. Okay, I think that there is room for medication, because there are still 20 to 30% of people who do the course that don't get better. There's also those people who can't tolerate CBTI or don't want CBTI. I think the challenge comes is because it's easier to throw out a medication as a first-line treatment than it is to throw out CBTI as a first-line treatment, because there aren't that many therapists. That reimbursement system's not in the US. And there aren't enough therapists in the UK, for example. And so, when our primary care physicians are faced with somebody with insomnia, they may not even know about CBTI. If they know about it, they wouldn't know where to get it. They wouldn't know how reimbursement works for it. And so it might be easier and cheaper, potentially, to throw out a medication, but not thinking about the long-term impact that might have. And actually, CBTI is cheaper in the long term than medicating. But again, it's about availability, it's about training, and it's about knowledge.
So for people in the US who have insomnia, like what should they do? Should they call a UK physician and say, hey, I'll pay you cash? Like how should it work? Not physician, but expert.
Well, we are starting to see some really good work in the US around disseminating CBTI. There are some really good courses in the US. So lots of training is going on for physicians, and I know that it's small drips for such a big country. But we are starting to see some changes around credentialing sleep medicine. We're seeing some changes in the US around how many people can deliver CBTI. We're seeing the development of online CBTI as well. And so people can get it online. So we've increased that dissemination. I think that it's always a good idea, if somebody has insomnia in the US, that they should look at the Society for Behavioral Sleep Medicine website. That gives a list of credentialed centers, credentialed people. It gives them somewhere to go. And I think that then we can start to work on bigger aspects around credentialing and around the elements of reimbursement, which are always going to be slightly challenging.
I found online your 10 tips for great sleep.
Right.
I want to go through the list, and maybe you can just tell me like briefly what the point is. So number one, the bedroom is for sleeping.
Bedroom should be for sleep or sex. And so the more behaviors that you introduce into a bedroom, the less likelihood is that you're going to create that really strong association between sleep and bed. So think about it this way. If I am only allowed sleep and sex, what are the chances that I'm going to get sleep? Well, according to Bootsin, who created this idea, he said 50%, and I think he's a very, very lucky man. Think about it this way, though. If you introduce a book, a video, your tablet, games, knitting, God forbid you might clean your bedroom, sleep might still be an option, sex. Now it's become watered down. Now, of course, these rules are really only for people who've got a problem sleeping. If you don't have a problem sleeping, I don't care what you've got in your bedroom, honestly.
Number two, keep cool.
Our bodies like to be cold at night. So keeping the bedroom cool, 18 to 20 degrees, is optimal so that we're not actually heating the body up unnecessarily, fragmenting our sleep.
Number three, avoid noises. Intermittent, I don't know how to say that word.
Intermittent noise. Yeah. So a lot of people have tried different noises in the bedroom to try to mask. And I remember talking to one patient who had the Amazon rainforest.
Yeah.
Absolutely horrifying thing to do. Why would you want to sleep with a macaw? Rhythmic noises actually help the brain, and the brain responds to rhythmic noises. Intermittent noises are going to create more of those K complexes going, oh, is that normal? Is that normal? And certainly in the case of a macaw, it's not normal unless you are in the jungle.
Yeah, so like if we have a lullaby at night for kids and it's not a good idea, or it's a good idea?
Generally not a great idea. Again,
Gotcha.
if they're sleeping well, it doesn't matter what they're listening to. But if there are slight problems or concerns, then let's try to keep it rhythmic.
Be comfortable, number four.
Absolutely. There's nothing worse than sleeping in an uncomfortable environment. We can't recommend a mattress or a pillow because we're all very, very different. But certainly giving yourself opportunity to get a good mattress, get good pillows that work for you. This is terrifying. We spend a third of our lives in bed, and yet we are afraid to spend more than 30 minutes lying on a bed in a superstore.
Yeah.
I go in there and I will lie there for a full 30 minutes, and then I'll turn over. Then I'll invite somebody over to see what it's like if I've got a partner. I can spend a whole day there because I'm going to be buying something which lasts me at least 10 years, and I'll be using 33% of my day.
I mean, you need to go through the full cycle. How about that? Sleep cycle. That's how it should be done. Darken the room. Number five.
We really need to keep a dark environment. If we can see light, then it's going to impact us by changing the cycles of melatonin and cortisol. Mm-hmm. So you really want to keep the room cool, dark, and quiet. Now, I'm not going to advocate that this is not that sort of show. We're not going to talk about having a makeover for your bedroom. If you can't afford it, get eye mask. An eye mask will do the same thing as some beautiful louver blinds.
Number six, detect any sleep problems.
Yeah, I like people not to over-monitor their sleep, but if they see a change in their sleep, a rapid change in sleep, that's usually a really good indicator that something's going wrong. And so in the background, noticing, that was a really crappy night, but don't worry about it. Second night, that's not so good. It's about, one bad night does not insomnia make, but if you start to see a pattern of poor sleep, it's a great idea to jump on it quickly before it becomes embedded.
Wind down routine?
Yes, my favorite. A couple of hours before bedtime, I usually do it around 7 o'clock in the evening. I sit down and I give myself the opportunity to worry. And I will write down everything I've done today, everything I've got to do tomorrow, everything that I've put in place to deal with tomorrow. And then I'll give myself 20 minutes to worry. And I'll ask myself, can I do something about that? If the answer is no, I put it on my to-do list for tomorrow. I might think of something. If there is something I can do, but not tonight, again, put it on my list of to-dos tomorrow. If there's something I can do about it, get off your bum and do it. It leaves you feeling in control.
Number 8, avoid alcohol. I think you described one.
Yeah, we've talked about that. Using alcohol to sleep, not a good idea.
Number 9, watch what you eat.
Yeah, there are certain foods which are going to make it more difficult to fall asleep, and there's certain foods that are going to enhance your ability to sleep. Things such as very spicy food, very fatty food, foods that are hard to digest can impact on the sleep that you get at night, especially if you eat quite close to bedtime. Lighter foods like cereals, like milk, they're less likely to impact on your sleep because they're easily digestible. What you don't want to create is a situation where your body has to make a decision. Do I digest the food or do I sleep? Because digestion will always win.
Number 10, limit napping during the day, which we discussed.
Which we discussed. Keep it short and keep it early, or give yourself a full 90 minutes.
One question I have when I saw Benjamin, your cat, is do animals and pets have the same sleep cycles as humans?
That's a great question. They don't tend to have the same cycling patterns that we do, and certainly not the same circadian patterns that we do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I'm a horrifying hypocrite in the sense that we should say no pets in the bedroom, whereas Benjamin is allowed. And that's actually quite detrimental, because one of the things that we know is that if Benjamin starts to cry, for example, it's exactly the same wavelength that you might see from a crying baby.
Yeah.
And so whereas we might, we talked about stage 2, and where we might say, oh, the neighbors are rowing, who cares, unless you want to hear it, of course. If I hear Benjamin crying, it will create an alerting response to wake up, because it's the same frequency. So they don't sleep at the same times that we do, and they don't have the same sleep lengths that we do. So yes, maybe we shouldn't really have domesticated animals. But you know what? I'm going to live with it.
Well, Professor Ellis, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
No, absolute pleasure.